What would you do if one day, your HOA sent you a letter demanding that you tear out your perfectly good driveway and replace it, for no reason other than neighborhood standards? That's exactly what happened to me. And let me tell you, I wasn't about to let some overreaching HOA president tell me my own work wasn't good enough. I've spent 30 years as a contractor, building homes with my own two hands. I don't cut corners, I don't skimp on materials, and I damn sure know how to pour a driveway that'll last a lifetime. Mine was no exception, 15 years old, solid concrete, reinforced with steel, perfectly graded for drainage. It was my pride and joy, a piece of craftsmanship that reminded me of the value of doing things right the first time. For years, our neighborhood, Pine Creek Estates, was a peaceful place. The HOA wasn't perfect, but under Bob Hastings, it was reasonable. Bob was an old-school guy, fair and practical. He'd stop by while I was working in my yard, swapping construction stories and asking for advice on his own home projects. But then, Bob retired and moved to Florida, and that's when everything changed. The first time I met Karen Winters, I knew trouble had arrived. She took over the HOA like a CEO taking over a failing company, walking into that first meeting in a crisp designer suit, eyes scanning the room like she was sizing up competition. Her speech was all about improving the community and enhancing property values, but something about the way she smiled, tight-lipped, never reaching her eyes, made me uneasy. Within a month, she'd passed 20 new rules: how tall our grass could be, what colors we could paint our shutters, even which flowers we were allowed to plant. At first, I ignored her. My house was well maintained, my lawn was cut, and I'd followed every building code when I built my home. I figured she was just another HOA president on a power trip, and as long as I stayed out of her way, I'd be fine. Then, one morning, I found a bright red envelope in my mailbox. A $500 fine. The reason? Unauthorized driveway modification. I read that notice 3 times, convinced it had to be a mistake. My driveway had been there for 15 years, and I had every permit to prove it. That was when I realized Karen wasn't just making up rules, she was coming after me. I wasn't about to pay a $500 fine for something that had been perfectly legal for 15 years. The next day, I marched over to Karen's house, a thick folder in hand, copies of my permits, the city approval, and even old photos showing the driveway being built. She was outside, watering her roses, a picture of suburban perfection. But the second she saw me, her shoulders tensed. Before I could even speak, she turned, her voice clipped. If this is about the fine, there's nothing to discuss. Your driveway is out of compliance. I held up the paperwork. It's been here since before you even lived in this neighborhood. It's up to code. Approved by the city. You're making a mistake. She didn't even glance at the documents. Rules are rules, Mr. Carter. It doesn't match the updated neighborhood aesthetic. I gritted my teeth. You mean the aesthetic you just made up last month? Her expression didn't change. If you have concerns, you can appeal to the HOA board. I knew damn well there was no board. Just Karen. She had full control. And worse, I wasn't the only one dealing with her nonsense. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing my neighbors getting hit with ridiculous violations. Mark Reynolds, the guy 2 houses down, got fined because his fence was 2 inches too high, even though it was the exact same height as everyone else's. Lisa Monroe had to rip out her entire garden because Karen claimed her tomato plants were an eyesore. And then there was Maggie Alvarez, a widow living on a fixed income, who got a notice saying she had 60 days to replace her driveway, or the HOA would put a lien on her home. That's when I knew this wasn't just about keeping the neighborhood nice. Something else was going on. I started tracking the fines, keeping notes every time someone got a violation. And a pattern started to emerge. The people getting hit the hardest? Longtime homeowners who'd been here for years. The people who weren't getting fined? A handful of newer residents who seemed strangely close to Karen. Then I noticed something else. Every time someone was forced to redo their driveway, sidewalk, or fence, they were required to use the same contractor, Elite Construction Solutions. I'd never heard of them before Karen took over, but suddenly, they were the only approved company for any HOA-mandated repairs. I did some digging. Elite Construction was owned by Karen's son, Michael Winters. That's when it all clicked. This wasn't about neighborhood standards. This was a money-making scheme. Karen was fabricating violations, forcing homeowners to redo work that didn't need fixing, and funneling all the business straight to her son's company. And the worst part? The work was garbage. I started looking closer at the jobs Elite Construction had done around the neighborhood. Driveways cracking after a few months. Fences warping from cheap materials. Puddles forming where new sidewalks were supposedly fixed. These weren't just overpriced jobs, they were shoddy, rushed, and outright dangerous. Then I remembered something. A few years ago, Karen had asked me to do a high-end renovation on her house. She wanted a luxury patio, custom stonework, the works. But when she hinted that I should cut a few corners to save her money, I told her flat out I don't do cheap work. She didn't like that answer. And now, here she was, using her power to punish me, and anyone else she could squeeze money from. The more I uncovered, the angrier I got. Karen wasn't just abusing her position, she was ruining people's lives. And I wasn't going to sit back and let her do it. I wasn't the only one fed up with Karen's nonsense. More neighbors started coming to me, sharing their own horror stories. Mark Reynolds showed me his fine for his supposedly too tall fence, along with a quote from Elite Construction that was nearly 3 times what a normal contractor would charge. Lisa Monroe had emails from Karen, pressuring her to hire Elite to correct her garden after she refused. And Maggie Alvarez? She had a bill in hand for a $112,000 driveway replacement, a job that should have cost a fraction of that. I knew I needed more than just stories. I needed proof. I filed a formal request for HOA financial records, knowing that as a homeowner, I had the legal right to see where our fees were going. Karen, of course, refused. She claimed the records were private and that I was harassing the HOA. I didn't back down. It took 3 written demands, a threat to contact a lawyer, and an ugly scene at a community meeting, but I finally got the documents. What I found made my blood boil. Karen had been using HOA funds like her personal bank account. Money that was supposed to go toward maintaining the neighborhood was instead paying for her luxury SUV lease, spa treatments, and vacations. Worse, every single repair job ordered by the HOA had been awarded to Elite Construction, without a single competitive bid. It was blatant corruption, right there in black and white. But Karen wasn't done tightening the noose. A week after I got the documents, I received another fine, this time for $5,000. The reason? My driveway supposedly had structural deficiencies that posed a safety hazard. That same day, a city inspector showed up unannounced. I knew right away something was off. He wouldn't meet my eye, barely even looked at the driveway before scribbling "fail" on his clipboard. After he left, I caught up with him in the parking lot. "Be honest with me," I said. "Karen put you up to this, didn't she?" He hesitated, then sighed. "Look, man, this isn't about your driveway. She told me to fail you, no matter what." Then he leaned in. "And you're not the only one. She's making an example out of you." That was when I realized Karen wasn't just trying to fine me into submission, she wanted to drive me out. And I wasn't the only target. Maggie came to me in tears that evening. She'd just received a final warning from the HOA. If she didn't hire Elite to replace her driveway within 30 days, they would start foreclosure proceedings on her home. Foreclosure. Karen was pushing people into losing their homes over fake violations. And once those homes went up for sale, they were being bought by real estate investors Karen had ties to. That was her endgame. This wasn't just about funneling business to her son's company. She was manufacturing violations to force people out, then profiting off the sales. I was furious. But I wasn't about to let her get away with it. I started documenting everything. I took daily photos of my driveway to prove nothing had changed. I saved copies of every fine, every letter, every inflated quote from Elite. And then I started digging into Elite's work history. That's when things got even worse. Not only was Elite charging obscene prices, but their work wasn't even up to code. I found driveways they'd poured just 6 months ago that were already cracking. Fences that were leaning. Sidewalks that pooled water after every rain. And yet, somehow, every one of their jobs had passed inspection. That's when I reached out to David Lawson, a guy I knew who worked in the city permit office. When I told him what was going on, he looked uneasy. "Yeah," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I've noticed something weird with Elite Construction." He pulled up some records and my stomach turned. Elite had failed multiple city inspections. Their materials were subpar, their work was sloppy, and they never should have been approved. "But they always get approved anyway," Dave muttered. I stared at him. "How?" He hesitated, then exhaled. "Because someone up top is overriding the failures." Karen had friends in the city government. That's why Elite kept getting approved despite their terrible work. That's why my driveway, a driveway built better than anything Elite had ever touched, had suddenly been deemed a hazard. She was untouchable. Or so she thought. Because if she wanted a fight, she was about to get one. I knew I was running out of time. Karen had already set her sights on foreclosing Maggie's home, and if I didn't act fast, more of us would be next. She thought she had us backed into a corner, but she made one crucial mistake. She underestimated how far I was willing to go to expose her. I spent the next week piecing together everything I had. I created a detailed timeline of fines, violations, and forced repairs. I highlighted every connection between Karen and Elite Construction, backing it up with HOA records, financial documents, and the absurdly inflated invoices homeowners had been forced to pay. The most damning piece of evidence? A confidential email from an HOA board meeting Karen never meant for us to see, in which she casually discussed targeting specific homeowners for fines, listing out which ones were most likely to sell under pressure. She wasn't just creating violations, she was strategically picking off long-term residents, forcing them out so her investor friends could scoop up their homes at a discount. But just when I thought I had enough, Karen made a move I never saw coming. A letter arrived in my mailbox. Not another fine, an official cease and desist notice, accusing me of harassment, defamation, and attempting to destabilize the HOA. It claimed that my reckless actions were causing irreparable harm to the community and threatened legal action if I continued my so-called campaign against the board. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but then I realized exactly what she was doing. Karen knew I was close to exposing her, so she was trying to discredit me first. If she could paint me as some unhinged troublemaker before I went public, she might be able to turn the neighborhood against me. I wasn't about to let that happen. That night, I called a meeting of my own, not a secret HOA meeting, but a gathering of every homeowner who had been screwed over by Karen. We met in Maggie's living room, her voice shaking as she read her foreclosure notice aloud. Mark shared his insane fence fine, Lisa showed everyone the threatening emails from Karen, and one by one, people started realizing they weren't alone. We had the pieces of the puzzle, but we needed to make it impossible for her to cover it up. That's when we made the decision. We weren't taking this to the city, we were going straight to the state. I compiled everything into a massive report and sent it directly to the State Housing Board, bypassing the corrupt city officials Karen had in her pocket. I included photos of Elite Construction's failed work, copies of the fraudulent violations, proof of her personal financial gains, and the damning investor emails. And just in case Karen tried to bury this quietly, we did something she never expected: we went to the press. A few days later, the local news station ran an exposé. HOA president accused of targeting homeowners in corrupt construction scheme. The story spread like wildfire. And before Karen even had a chance to fight back, state investigators were knocking on her door. The fallout was swift and brutal. The morning after the news broke, state investigators arrived unannounced, going through every HOA record, every contract signed with Elite Construction. They didn't just find fraud, they uncovered a full-blown criminal operation. Not only had Karen been funneling money to her son's company, but she had also been receiving kickbacks from real estate investors who'd purchased the homes she forced into foreclosure. Worse yet, the investigators found dozens of safety violations in the construction work Elite had done, all rubber-stamped by corrupt city officials who were now scrambling to cover their tracks. But the final nail in Karen's coffin? The list of targeted homeowners she had compiled. Proof that every fine, every forced repair, had been part of a deliberate plan to push certain people out. When confronted, Karen tried to play the victim, claiming she had only been trying to improve the neighborhood. That excuse didn't last long. Within a week, she and her son were arrested for fraud, conspiracy, and multiple violations of state housing laws. With Karen gone, the HOA held an emergency election. Mark Reynolds was voted in as president, with a full 5-person board to ensure no single person could ever have unchecked power again. Their first order of business? Canceling every bogus fine Karen had issued and refunding thousands of dollars to homeowners who had been scammed. The state also forced Elite Construction to pay damages, covering the cost of fixing their shoddy work. Maggie got to keep her home. Lisa's garden is growing again. The fences, the driveways, the walkways, everything Karen tried to destroy was restored. And my driveway? The one she called out of compliance? It passed every inspection with flying colors. Karen's house went up for sale, and a young family moved in, bringing life back to the street she once ruled with an iron fist. The HOA still exists, but now it actually serves the community instead of controlling it. People smile again when they see each other. They help their neighbors instead of worrying about ridiculous fines. Looking back, I realized this was never just about my driveway. It was about standing up for what's right, no matter how powerful the person standing in your way seems to be. Because bullies like Karen only win if people stay silent. Have you ever felt powerless against HOA rules, or a Karen in your life? Share your experience below. Let's see who had it worse.